Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Commander's Quarters decks are built within a $25 budget, that's $25 for 100 cards. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's commander is Nikya of the Old Ways. Nikya is a 5/5 centaur druid that costs 3 red-green. She has you can't cast non-creature spells, and whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. Not being able to cast non-creature spells is definitely a downside, but she more than makes up for that by doubling up our mana. So with this deck, we're going to be ramping and casting a ton of giant creatures, and we have exactly 0 non-creature spells in the deck. So our strategy for this deck is pretty simple. We want to get Nikya out quickly in order to double up our mana. Green definitely has access to the best forms of ramp in the game, and we're going to lean into that. But specifically, we're going to be casting creatures that bring more lands onto the battlefield or interact with our lands to produce more mana. And then how we win with this deck is pretty simple. We're going to cast a ton of huge creatures to demolish our opponents. Just swinging with a bunch of giant beaters is perhaps the most GRUUL way to win. And since we can't cast any non-creature spells, we're going to be running some creatures that have some pretty unique effects that help us out as well. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's first go on to tactic number 1, Planned Land. First up, there's Arbor Elf, which can tap to untap target forest. And then there's Voyaging Satyr, which can tap to untap any of our lands. While these creatures don't increase our land count, they still help ramp us and benefit from Nikya's effect. Next up is Sky Shroud Ranger, which we can tap to put a land card from our hand into play, but we can only play this ability anytime we could play a sorcery. We're running plenty of lands in this deck, so early and later on in the game this can come in huge by getting some extra lands into play. And then we're going to be running Veteran Explorer, which has, when it dies, each player may search their library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield, then each player who searched their library this way shuffles it. Now unfortunately this also helps our opponents ramp, but we're going to take more advantage of it because of our commander. And next up there's Diligent Farmhand and Dawn Trader Elk, both of which we can sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. And then there's Wood Elves and Yavimaya Dryad, both of which pretty much do the exact same thing for us. When they enter the battlefield we can search our library for a forest and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Next up, we're going to be running Elvish Rejuvenator, which when it enters the battlefield, we can look at the top 5 cards of our library, and then we can put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. And then there's Farhaven Elf and Yavimaya Granger, each of which pretty much do the exact same thing. When they enter the battlefield, we're going to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Yavimaya Granger does have a slight downside though, because it does have an echo cost, but that's not that big of a deal. And finally, we're going to be running Fertilid, which enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And then at any time, we can pay 1 into green to remove one of those +1/+1 counters from it to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Our goal is to get Nikya out as early as possible, so we're going to be shooting for turn 3 or turn 4. Because once we have her out, we're going to be doubling up all of our mana and casting huge creatures. But there are some other ways to even further massively ramp with this deck. Let's go through them now in tactic number 2, Bountiful Harvest. First up, there's Magus of the Candelabra, which actually doesn't ramp us to start. It allows us to pay X and tap it to untap X target lands. Now, just on its own, it can be pretty underwhelming, but once our commander's in play, this card comes in huge. So let's say we have Magus of the Candelabra out with our commander in play in 5 lands. We can tap those lands for 10 mana thanks to Nikya's effect. We can then use 5 of that mana to tap Magus of the Candelabra to untap those 5 lands. By tapping those lands again, suddenly we have 15 mana coming from just 5 lands. This can get even more out of control if we have Keeper of Progenitus in play. Keeper of Progenitus has, whenever a player taps a mountain, forest, or plains for mana, that player adds 1 mana to his or her mana pool of any type that land produced. So with this and Nikya in play, our mountains and forests are each going to tap for 3 mana. But what are we going to cast with all this mana? Let's go through some creatures that help us dig deeper into our deck for the right cards in tactic number 3, Nature Provides. First up there's Drum Hunter, which can tap for a colorless, but it also has at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 5 or greater, you may draw a card. Luckily for us, we're running a ton of creatures in this deck that meet that requirement, including our commander. Next up is Runic Armasaur, which says whenever an opponent activates an ability of a creature or land that isn't a mana ability, you may draw a card. There are plenty of creatures and lands that are used in Commander that can trigger this, so we're going to be getting a ton of value out of this throughout the game. And then we're going to be running Garruk's Pack Leader, which says whenever another creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. There are plenty of big creatures in this deck, so Garruk's Pack Leader is going to draw us a lot of cards. And then we're going to be running 2 creatures with similar effects with Beast Whisperer and Soul of the Harvest. Beast Whisperer says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. And Soul of the Harvest says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Unlike Garruk's Pack Leader, they don't have that power requirement, so we're even going to benefit from some of our smaller creatures. Next up is Ulvenwald Observer, which is going to benefit us whenever one of our bigger creatures dies. It says whenever a creature you control with toughness 4 or greater dies, draw a card. Now with this deck, we still don't want those creatures to die, but at least we get a benefit when they do. And finally, we're going to be running 2 creatures that can draw us a ton of cards when they come into play. First, there's Sandstone Oracle, which says when it enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. If that player has more cards in hand than you, draw cards equal to the difference. So if we're running low on cards and our opponent has a full grip, we can draw a ton of cards once this comes into play. And then when Regal Force enters the battlefield, we're going to draw a card for each green creature we control. The majority of creatures in this deck are green, so we're going to be drawing a ton of cards once this comes into play. Now, drawing cards isn't the only way for us to get set up and to get some card advantage. So let's go through some more ways to do that in tactic number 4, Herd the Horde. First up, there's Dustwatch Recruiter, which has pay 2 and a green to look at the top 3 cards of your library, and then you can reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Every single non-land card in this deck is a creature, so chances are we're going to be revealing a creature out of those 3 cards. It also has, though, at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, transform Dustwatch Recruiter. It transforms into Krellin Horde Howler, which says creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So not only can this card provide us with some card advantage by getting creatures from the top of our library into our hand, but it can also make our creature spells cost less to cast. Next up, there's Garruk's Horde, which has split the top card of your library revealed, and you may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card. Again, every single one of the non-land cards in this deck are creatures, so chances are the top card of our library is going to be a creature. Allowing us to continually cast the top card of our deck as long as it's a creature is an incredible effect for this deck. And then we're going to be running Paleoloth, which has whenever another creature with power 5 or greater comes into play under your control, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a fantastic way for us to recur some of our best creatures that might have died throughout the game. And finally, we're going to be running some creatures that can tutor for other creatures. First up is Fierce Empath, and when it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a creature card with converted mana cost 6 or greater and put it directly into our hand. This is an incredible effect that helps us get the right creature for the right situation. One Volley Beast Tracker is similar but not quite as good. When it enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for a creature card with Death Touch, Hexproof, Reach, or Trample and reveal it, and then you shuffle your library and put that card on top of it. But there are still plenty of great creatures in this deck that meet one of those requirements. Lastly, there's Conduit of Ruin, which has a dual purpose for this deck. It has the first creature spell you cast each turn cost 2 less to cast, so this can even help us speed up our process in casting more and more creature spells each turn. On top of that, when we cast Conduit of Ruin, we can search our library for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater, reveal it, then shuffle our library and put that card on top of it. And some of our biggest threats in this deck even meet those requirements. So let's go through some of them now in tactic number 5, Out of This World. First up, there's Bane of Bala Ged, which has, when it attacks, defending player exiles 2 permanents he or she controls. And then we're going to be running Ulamog's Crusher, which has Annihilator 2, so whenever this creature attacks, the defending player has to sacrifice 2 permanents. Ulamog's Crusher does have to attack each combat if able, but since it's an 8/8, it's going to be hard for our opponents to kill. An Artisan of Kozilek has, when you cast this spell, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is a fantastic way for us to get one of our biggest threats directly back onto the battlefield. And on top of that, this card even has Annihilator 2. Forcing our opponents to either exile or sacrifice their permanents whenever one of these creatures attacks is a huge effect. With how quickly this deck can ramp, it's easy for us to get out one of these creatures early and completely shut out one of our opponents from the game. But these aren't the only threats that our opponents have to worry about. We're also going to be running Savage-Born Hydra, which has double strike and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. And then we can pay 1 in GRUUL to put a +1/+1 counter on Savage-Born Hydra, but we can only activate this ability only anytime we could cast a sorcery. This card can be a fantastic mana sink for us and can even be a one-hit kill in a lot of situations. And finally, we're going to be running Genesis Hydra, which costs X green, and when you cast Genesis Hydra, reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put a non-land permanent card with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield and then shuffle the rest into your library. So this creature allows us to look at the top X cards of our library and then put the best one of those creatures onto the battlefield. With the amount of mana that we can produce with this deck, we can dig very deep with this card. On top of that, it's going to enter as a big threat in itself because it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. Big beaters are great, but we want some more things like Genesis Hydra that have some effects that are more like non-creature spells. Since we can't cast non-creature spells with this deck, these creatures can come in really handy. So let's go through these creatures now in tactic number 6, Spellslingers. First up, there's Spellbreaker Behemoth, which can't be countered, and it says creature spells you control with power 5 or greater can't be countered. This card has the incredible effect of ensuring that we can cast a lot of our creature spells without any interference. And then we're going to be running Yevon Nature's Herald, which has Flash, and you may cast green creature spells as though they had Flash. This gives our deck a lot more flexibility in allowing us to cast our green creature spells whenever we want to. Next up is GRUUL Rage Beast, which has whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature fights target creature an opponent controls. This card is incredible in this deck and allows us to pick off a ton of our opponent's creatures since we're going to have the biggest creatures around. And then there's Emissary of Grudges, which is a pretty unique card. When it enters the battlefield, we have to secretly choose an opponent. And then you can reveal that player that you chose to choose new targets for target spell or ability if it's controlled by the chosen player and it targets you or a permanent you control. Now you can only activate this ability once, but it's an incredible effect that can really save you in the right situation. Next up is Nullstone Gargoyle, which can be an extremely oppressive card. It has whenever the first non-creature spell each turn is played, counter that spell. Now this card doesn't affect us at all since we're not playing any non-creature spells in this deck, but against certain opponents this can be extremely detrimental. Now this is an incredibly powerful effect, but this creature isn't quite the golden pig of the deck. The golden pig of the deck is the #1 card out of our 99. And the golden pig for this deck is Rurikthar the Unbowed. Rurikthar is a 6/6 Ogre Warrior with Vigilance and Reach, and it costs 4 red-green. It says Rurikthar the Unbowed attacks each combat if able, and whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Rurikthar deals 6 damage to that player. This is an incredibly oppressive card against certain decks, and it absolutely wrecks them. Every single time they cast a non-creature spell, they're going to take 6 damage. This is an incredibly high price to pay for something that most decks depend on. Again, this effect absolutely has no effect on us because we have 0 non-creature spells in this stack. But there are very few commander decks out there that have absolutely 0 non-creature spells. So chances are a lot of our opponents are going to be taking a ton of damage from Rurikthar. If he's not dealt with, all of our opponents are going to be in big trouble. And even if one of our opponents does deal with him, chances are they're going to be casting a non-creature spell to try to kill him, and they're going to be taking 6 damage. This card absolutely demolishes and shuts down a ton of decks, and that's why it's the golden pig. But what are some other ways that we can disrupt our opponent's game plan? Let's go through them now in tactic number 7, GRUUL Smash. First up, there's Manglehorn, which when it enters the battlefield, we can destroy target artifact, and then artifacts our opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So not only can this throw a wrench into our opponent's plan temporarily, but it can also slow them down. And then when Reclamation Sage enters the battlefield, we can destroy target artifact or enchantment. Next up is Brutalizer Exarch, which when it enters the battlefield, we get to choose one. If we need a specific creature, we can search our library for a creature card, reveal it, then shuffle our library, and then put that card on top of it. Or we can choose to put target non-creature permanent on the bottom of its owner's library. And then we're going to be running Sunder Shaman, which can't be blocked by more than one creature, and when it deals combat damage to a player, we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment that player controls. On top of that, it's a 5/5 for only 4 mana, which is a very good rate. Next up is Terastodon, which when it enters the battlefield, we can destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents, and for each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. That's a very small price to pay for dealing with those non-creature permanents. And then there's Molder Slug, which has at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact. A lot of commander decks run a decent amount of artifacts in them, and we're only running a few artifact creatures. One of those artifact creatures is Steel Hellkite. It has flying, and we can pay 2 to give it +1/+0 until the end of the turn. We can also pay X to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. We can only activate this ability once each turn. This is a fantastic way to deal with a ton of our opponent's permanents all at once. So we've talked a lot about dealing with our opponents, but what about protecting our own board? Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 8, Protect the Herd. First up, there's Whisperwood Elemental, which has at the beginning of your end step, manifest the top card of your library. And by sacrificing Whisperwood Elemental, until the end of the turn, face-up non-token creatures we control gain. When this creature dies, manifest the top card of your library. So if an opponent is going to Wrath our board, we can easily help build it back up with this card. Again, every single non-land card in this deck is a creature. And for those creatures that were manifested, we can turn them face up at any time for its mana cost. And then we're going to be running Temur Sabertooth, which has pay 1 and a green. You may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Temur Sabertooth gains indestructible until the end of the turn. This is a fantastic way to protect some of our key creatures, including our commander. Next up is Soul of New Phyrexia, which can protect all of our permanents. It has pay 5, permanents you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. And it can even help us when it's in our graveyard. We can pay 5 to exile it, and then permanents we control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. It's very easy for this deck to hold up at least 5 mana so that we can ensure that we protect our board. So we've talked about a lot of great creatures, but it never hurts to give them a little boost. Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 9, Quick Hits. First up, there's Anger, and as long as Anger is in our graveyard and we control a mountain, creatures we control have haste. Giving our creatures haste in this deck is huge because our attacks can come out of nowhere. Another great way to give our creatures haste is with Ogre Battle Driver. It has whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature gets +2/+0 and gains haste until the end of the turn. So not only can this help speed our creatures up, but it also pumps them too. And then we're going to be running some creatures that help give our team trample. As long as Brown is in our graveyard and we control a forest, creatures we control are going to have trample. And with Archetype of Aggression in play, creatures we control are going to have trample, and creatures our opponents control are going to lose trample and can't have or gain trample. Trample is a huge keyword for this deck, and it can help us punch through some damage over our opponent's defenses. But we've got some other powerful ways to finish off our opponents. Let's go through them now in tactic number 10, Nature Overcomes. First up, there's Magmatic Force, which has at the beginning of each upkeep, Magmatic Force deals 3 damage to any target. So if we need to pick off some of our opponent's smaller creatures with this, we can, or we can just go straight to our opponent's faces. Speaking of going straight to our opponent's faces, next up there's Flame Blast Dragon. It has flying, and whenever it attacks, you may pay X and a red. If you do, Flame Blast Dragon deals X damage to any target. So this is just basically a fireball on a stick, and we can put all of our mana into it to destroy one of our opponents. And then we're going to be running Engrass Marauders, which has if a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. This is a huge effect that can really speed up that kill clock on our opponents. Next up is Enray's Forerunners, which not only has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, but when it enters the battlefield, other creatures we control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until the end of the turn. So this not only can be a huge threat, but it makes all of our other creatures into even bigger threats. And then we're going to be running Hellkite Charger, which has Flying and Haste, and when it attacks, you can pay 5 red, and if you do, untap all attacking creatures, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. 7 mana is incredibly easy for this deck to produce. And with the right setup, we might even be able to do it more than once. With all these additional combat phases, we can easily finish off some of our opponents. Finally, we're going to be running some creatures that really help us get our attacks through. Bellowing Tangleworm has Intimidate, and other green creatures you control have Intimidate. The majority of creatures in this deck are green, and this is a fantastic way to get them through. And then there's Breaker of Armies, which has all creatures able to block Breaker of Armies do so. So when we swing at an opponent with Breaker of Armies, they're going to be forced to use all their creatures to block it, and then all of our other creatures are going to get through. Finally, we're going to be running Warmonger Hellkite, which has all creatures attack each combat if able. And pay 1 in a red, attacking creatures get +1/+0 until end of turn. So this forces all of our opponents' attack with all their creatures, leaving them basically defenseless. And chances are they're not going to want to swing at us since we've got the biggest army around. When it comes to our turn, we're going to swing out and then pump up our team with its ability. This deck is a ton of fun, especially if you like casting giant creatures and just swinging away. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up, we're going to be running Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land to put into play tapped. And then there's Mountain Valley, which enters the battlefield tapped, and we can tap to sacrifice it to search our library for either a mountain or a forest and put it onto the battlefield. Next up is Jund Panorama, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for either a mountain or a forest and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And then there's Warp Landscape, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up, we've got GRUUL Guildgate, Timber Gorge, Rugged Highlands, and Kazandu Refuge, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a red or a green. On top of that, Rugged Highlands and Kazandu Refuge will each gain us 1 life when they come into play. And then there's Blighted Woodland, which either taps for a colorless, or we can pay 3 and a green to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Finally, we're going to be running 28 basic lands, 20 of those will be a forest, and 8 will be a mountain. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Nikya EDHREC deck is going to set you back $153.54, so let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $24.95. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned in focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, we've got Primordial Sage, which comes in at $1.96. It's a 4/5 spirit that costs 4 green. It says, whenever you cast a creature spell, you may draw a card. So this card is just like another copy of Beast Whisperer, which is a great effect for this deck. And then there's Vizier of the Menagerie, which costs $3.19. It's a 3/4 Naga Cleric that costs 3 and a green. It says you may look at the top card of your library. You may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast creature spells. This card is a fantastic addition to the deck and is similar to Garruk's HOARD, but even better. Next up, there's Spearbreaker Behemoth, which comes in at $2.26. It's a 5/5 indestructible beast that costs 5 green. You can pay 1 to give target creature with power 5 or greater indestructible until the end of the turn. This is a fantastic way to protect some of the best creatures in this deck, including our commander. And then there's Kamal Fist of Krosa, which comes in at $6.65. It's a 4/3 human druid that costs 4 green. It has pay green, target land becomes a 1/1 creature until the end of the turn. It's still a land. And 2 green, creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until the end of the turn. This is an incredibly powerful overrun effect that we can do multiple times each turn. And don't underrate his first ability, that is a fantastic way to prevent wrath effects. If an opponent is going to wrath the board, we can just turn all their lands into creatures and they're going to be in big trouble. Next up is Pathbreaker Ibex, which comes in at $5.70. It's a 3/3 goat that costs 4 green. Whenever it attacks, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until the end of the turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Usually it only takes 1 swing with this to knock out 1 or even all of our opponents. Finally, there's Thunderfoot Baloth, which comes in at $2.08. It's a 5/5 beast with trample and it costs 4 green. It has Lieutenant. As long as you control your commander, Thunderfoot Baloth gets +2/+2 and other creatures you control get +2/+2 and have trample. This is a fantastic Anthem effect that can easily help us finish out the game. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, and then check out some of our playlists on budget commander decks, commander excluded decks, and break the bank episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.